All hear me? I have to get one thing out of the way first. My daughter doesn't believe me that I do these things, so I have to take a few pictures. So if you all just smile. Okay, there you go. Great. That's all set. There really are two American homes. Or I should say, maybe there is 1.0001 American home. We're all familiar with the vast majority of houses that are built in this country. Frank mentioned that. There are 75 million single-family houses in this country, and over half of those, as Frank mentioned, have been built in the last 40 years alone. It's estimated in the next 40 years we will need another 75 million homes because of the changing demographics in this country. We're familiar with this kind of project. This is actually something that's happening right now. The land is stripped of any valuable indigenous planting, and I'm actually surprised that that existing tree remains. No doubt it'll be gone in a short period of time. And so what I want to talk about tonight is a little bit about how we can look at this phenomena perhaps in a better and more interesting way. We're familiar with the phenomenon. This is a house from Ohio, and ugly might be one word we could use. I beg anyone to tell me how you get from the sidewalk to the front door of that house, which is probably one of the most interesting concerns any house might have. This one I found in Sudbury, and I'm reminded of this. When I see a house like this, I'm reminded of Oscar Wilde's quote that America was the only country that went from barbarism to decadence without civilization in between. The question, of course, is why we can't do better houses as we have in the past. And what I'd like to argue tonight is that we have done sensible, sustainable, and I would argue psychologically sound houses in the past. A house that expresses itself as the environment in which it sits. This house we're all familiar, it's almost a cliche at this point, but we tend to forget that in its day it was probably a most sustainable house around. The long roof facing north, the small windows, the large massing of the chimney in the middle to warm the house were all, anyway, in their day, energy efficiency efforts. We tend to forget that there are beautiful houses that existed in the 17th and 18th century, which had things such as gambrel roofs, probably the most efficient way to put space up on the top. We tend to forget all these things because we've let some timeless principles, in my mind, lapse. Each of us, I think, has our own energy history. And I want to argue here this evening that energy and perhaps water are the two most critical issues of our time. This is a photograph of my great-grandmother in the middle and my grandmother to her left in the early 20th century. It's obvious how they got around at that point in time. Very few years later, they had this touring car. That's my great-grandmother again on the left and my grandmother on the right, and my father sitting now on the hood of that car. By the 1930s or 40s, he had bought his own car, seating here, and had the newfangled invention called the radio, which he, by the way, built himself. I grew up in Canton, Ohio. This was our kitchen. There was no granite countertops, no Genair stove, but there was two new inventions that were huge energy users, but very convenient for the time. By the 1960s, my father had bought a Bonneville Pontiac with 400 horsepower that used more gas than we can imagine, and was touring the countryside with his young family, using up a great deal of energy, but of course it was cheap, and that was the issue. When I went to school, this was the Bible. It had already been printed about 20 years earlier. It was actually published by the same publishing house that published my book, Princeton Architectural Press. But it was really the first book that I found, and one of the early books on regionalism in architecture, and this actually was all over the world, arguing for the first time that there were scientific principles behind saving energy and sustainability, and that indeed in many cultures in the past these issues were already expressed in their architecture.
What year was that?
This is, I believe, 1960, published. In 1982, I built my first house, which is this house in Newton, Massachusetts. I built it for $65,000, and I got a $10,000 tax credit for doing that little, what was then called controllable passive system at the roof. Now, it had it had a shutter that moved up and down when the sun came out. It had 2 house fans, really window fans, that blew hot air from that space when it became a certain temperature into the house. And it had black tanks that preheated the water into the water tank in the basement. In about 5 years, I realized it didn't work at all, and I ripped the whole thing out. But the lesson I think that I learned, and I thought we all should learn, is that most of the solar movement in that time was really about the technological advances and not really about the architecture. I would ask you to name on your one hand 5 solar houses from the 1980s or this period of time that remain today that are interesting and good to look at. It was a movement that was good intentioned, but it really didn't work. It was supported by tax credits, and in fact, when energy became cheap again, it went the way of all movements. The one good thing about the movement, though, was that we, for the first time, began to look closely at windows. We began to look closely at heating systems. We began to look closely at insulation. And those lessons eventually were carried forward in the late 20th century and early 21st century in the so-called green movement of today. My argument this evening is that that green movement, to some extent, is false. That it has become, again, a kind of list on which we have to rely in order to make something sustainable, when in fact there are many, many timeless rules that we can pay attention to that will make our houses sustainable without the list of going through LEEDs or the expense of doing all that. As Frank mentioned, I've written 2 previous books at Taunton Press, the first, The Distinctive Home, and the second, The Face of Home. And as he also mentioned, the point of writing those books was to come up with what I thought were very simple principles about designing houses. And there were 4. 1, site the house right. 2, do plans that actually make sense the way you live today. 3, and this is a hard one, make your houses beautiful. People don't believe that we can, or that anyone has their own definition. I happen to believe that beauty is just as learnable and affordable as anything else. And 4th, that the details are consistent with those 3 principles to begin with. The Face of Home was an examination of the 3rd principle, and my current book that I'll speak about in more detail is about the 1st principle, how to site your house properly. Taunton Press at the time didn't really want to publish a book on siting. They thought it wouldn't sell. This was in the early 2000s when I was publishing the other books, and they were probably right. Interestingly enough, in about 2008, I went to Princeton Architectural Press, and I asked them would they be interested in doing a book on siting as a sustainable issue in our culture. And they actually jumped on the notion because at that point in time, greening was becoming a very, very important issue for our country. Again, the idea here is that these issues are not new. They're as old as architecture itself. We just have to rethink and relook at the way we're thinking about sustainability, at least in our houses. What I did was approach a number of architects from around the country, and I'm happy to see a number of them here this evening, as well as a number of friends and colleagues. That's wonderful that you're here to share this passion with me tonight. The idea was to select a number of architects that I had known from my course at Harvard in the summer and others, houses I'd seen, that would demonstrate a kind of regional approach to their architecture so that we could reintroduce, if you will, into the lexicon of architecture the notion that regionalism actually makes a difference, that you can't build a center entrance colonial house in Florida and air condition it and call it sustainable. You actually have to build a house that belongs in its own way to Florida. I should take a little sidebar trip here. My interest in the site comes out of not just an architectural interest, but also an interest in painting that Frank mentioned. And this is down in Duxbury Green Harbor area where I paint quite often. And about 15 years ago, I went to my partners and I said that I'd like to take Fridays off. I was getting pretty tired of the mechanisms of faxes and emails and all the rest, and I just needed a break from it all. And I even took a 20% pay cut to prove that I was serious about this endeavor. And what I found, which was very interesting, and I never would have imagined, is that instead of just being a rest, landscape painting became a way to sharpen my intuitions. So that the other 4 days, when I went back into the office, I actually was better as an architect than I had been previously to doing landscape painting. But the other issue about landscape painting to me is that it's very much like architecture. There's space, there's light. By the way, all these paintings are for sale, in case anyone's interested.
Paddles to hand out your
No, paddle, we can do paddles, yeah. Actually, Jimmy Ryder's here tonight, owns this painting, so I can't sell this one. The thing that was interesting to me about landscape painting was that subtle topographical change, that edge that is consistent in the landscape always, the nature of distance, of contrast. All these issues that are very subtle in the landscape are also very real in architecture. And it enabled me to somehow look at the siting of houses in a slightly different way than I was looking at before. Well, we found this house in South Carolina. It was on our way to a client house, and it's actually a barn, I think, being gradually taken over by kudzu, and I think it's kudzu, is that how you say it? It's an invasive plant that came from Asia, and it's a kind of metaphor, if you will, for a house in the landscape, because in a way, it's this kind of sense that we want all our houses really to be, is not to stand up proud, but actually to be part of Mother Nature in some sort of wonderful way. Now, I want to say before I get into some examples from the book that I'm completely agnostic when it comes to style. I don't really care whether a house is traditional or modern in the least. What I really care about is that houses have integrity, that they're well built, that they're sensitive to the environment and the sites in which they sit, and if you like a traditional style house, that's your business. If you like modern, that's your business. I do happen to believe, however, that out of the site come certain clues to how one can actually make a house feel as if it belongs to the site. And that's really the point of the book, is that each one of these clues are not only inherent in the house itself, but also inherent in the site. So what we did in the book was to take a number of regions, this one coastal New England to start with, and examine how they might be different than other regions and how they might get expressed in their houses. And this is sort of the meat of the argument, is how do we do that. I'll start with one of our houses, and there's only two, I should say, in the book of us. And this book wasn't meant as a puff piece for Eck McNeely so much as a concept book about how, in fact, you should do a better house. But since I'm here tonight, I'll start with one of ours. This is a house down in Falmouth, Massachusetts, and really what I want to do is explain why it is what it is in terms of sustainability. It seems like it's a big house, although in fact it isn't quite as big as it seems. There was a house there that was an old 19th century house, and there's a 19th century tradition in the neighborhood. The house that was there was 4 or 5 feet off the ground. It bared little relationship to the land. It was also dark inside, and essentially viewless, which was surprising since this was right along the coast. We convinced the owner to push the house back towards the street, which you can imagine someone buying a coastal property would be a little reluctant to do. But it allowed us to do two things. One is to find a flatter portion of the site so that the house could sit more evenly on the topography. Second, it allowed us to turn and twist the house for sun and views, and in a way make this site and house worthwhile. So you can see here what I mean by a house that belongs to the site and is really a part of that experience by being able to see through the front door and really only a couple steps up. I think a very lost art is how you bring a house down close to the ground and make it feel a part of the landscape. It's also a house that's only one room deep, so that you can ventilate this house in the summertime quite easily by simply opening up windows on one side. It's a house that takes advantage, as I mentioned earlier, of some 19th century notions, particularly the low roofs around the outer edges. But the truth is that those notions were there for reasons to begin with, and that is that you need shade, places to sit, so why not use them in the 21st century? Although the interpretation here is a bit more contemporary, perhaps, in the edges and the way in which this house reaches to the sky. The inside is quite contemporary, much more open plan, as you can see here up in the upper right, much to the liking of the owner, who was playing this balance between the neighborhood of traditional homes, which he and she were very afraid to offend, but also this sense of wanting a very open plan, one that is more contemporary in its passion. Another house in Rhode Island, again along the water, and you asked yourself, okay, now what is it about coastal New England that's different than, say, coastal California? It's hot and it's cold, and those temperature changes are very dramatic. And so you have to allow for that in the environment of these houses in some way. This house by Estes Twomley down in Rhode Island, a friend of mine, I think is very interesting because what they have done is actually split the house into two. They've actually taken, let me see if I can get this to work. Yeah, they've actually taken two parts. There's a guest room and a living dining area, and then there's a living room, and they've split it down the middle so you can actually, when you arrive, see through the house, and you can see that right here. And nicely enough, there's actually two screen porches, one facing the water and one facing the morning, which I find a really wonderful idea. You see here this opening between. Now, so you asked yourself, why is this so interesting? Well, I think because it means the house to those around you, not just the owners, is you feel it's much more a part of the landscape, much more related to the water, allows really your neighbors to take part in that experience. It's not a big clunker blocking your view in any way at all. It's actually broken down into what I call a compound plan. And that is, you take certain parts of the program and you put them in different parts of the architecture instead of putting them all into one mass. You break the mass down into parts, and that helps bring the scale of the house down in a lot of wonderful ways. And finally, in the coastal New England, this house in Maine, interesting because here's a really large site. You can see here, and with water down here. They could have easily said to the architect, I want to drive all the way down here, and I'm going to put a house right along the water, and that's what I'm paying for, and that's what I want. Instead, interestingly enough, they came up with the idea of putting the house close to the woods at the edge of this large, expansive meadow, so that you find your way through the woods to a house that then overlooks a large meadow and the water beyond. And the architect conceptualized that idea in some of these early sketches, and you can see here finally this sketch here where you arrive and you see this wonderful view to the beyond. Instead of crowding the water and bringing a road all the way down through this blueberry meadow, he was able to convince the clients to push it up tight to the edge of the woods. And at the same time provide a kind of vernacular architecture here that's both old and new for Maine. Looks like a barn in a lot of wonderful ways, but also has this kind of horizontal window scheme that makes it clearly look in a more contemporary way. And here is the final plan. You can see what they did is they pushed it up against the woods. They made an L shape which has a little outside court, south-facing court, so that in those times of the year when the winds blow, you can sit out there in the quiet and the sun, really wonderful. But at the same time, because you've done an L, you have exposed all the views and all the wonderful aspects of this house to what this site is really all about, and that is the water. Another type, and again, I'm reminding myself constantly that this book is really about regionalism in lots of ways and how these houses can be different depending on where they sit. And the point is, through all this, that any house should feel as if it belongs to the environment in which it sits. And I'll keep saying that over and over because I think it's something we've forgotten and that we have to relearn in a kind of funny way. So what's interesting about hot and arid climate? Well, it's hot during the day, it's dry. Texas, as you know, I've just met someone this weekend who said that they were from Texas and they'd had 100 straight days of over 100-degree temperatures. And as you know, there have been wildfires there. It can be a pretty nasty environment. But at night it can cool down, and that is not, and that idea is something that can be used in the architecture. This looks like a big house, but it's actually only about 3,500 square feet. It's broken down again into parts. It turns around a kind of central court in which you enter, and then the expansive views to the distance. Now, the architect was asked by the owner to put this house on top of the hill. And the architect, I think, wisely convinced the owners no, that they should push it down the hill, make it feel like it's, as Frank Lloyd Wright used to say, not on the hill, but in the hill. And at the same time save a number of the existing trees and take advantage of a little brook that was already existing there. Wonderful rendering. This is Michael Ember from Austin, Texas. San Antonio, sorry. And what's so wonderful about this house environmentally to me is this notion of a house that seems to kind of grow out of the ground, made of stone that's available in the area, and a roof that is a very light, open, and airy structure, so that you have this wonderful sense that this is a house that will gather heat during the day, will allow itself to ventilate nicely, and at the same time at night some of that heat will be given off in the mass of that house. Again, this is not a new idea. This is as old as the Indians themselves. Nice thing is some of the interesting contemporary pieces that he's added to that. The saving of these existing oaks is quite nice. There's a wonderful little fountain here off the master bedroom that I think is a wonderful contrast between the arid culture of Texas and a kind of reminder really of what is important in the environment of this house and the environment that's around you. Again, that wonderful living room, open, airy space, and this great sense of structure and stone in which this house was built as a part of the Texas landscape. Another house in hot and arid, this by Will Bruder from Phoenix. I think one of the nice things about this house is there's a road, a pavement here, and then there's a dirt road. And he did that purposefully so that when you come off that pavement, the sound becomes already different. And you all know what the sound of rubber tires against pavement is, against sound against stone. And so all of a sudden you begin to feel like you're arriving at this wonderful spot. He turns the back wall of the house and sort of encompasses the living space with a view out towards this little brook that, you know, in New England we would flip off the end of our finger, but there is really quite something for them. And this little wonderful notion of squeezing you down to the entrance here, the very Frank Lloyd Wright idea, and then exploding on the other side. Look at how wonderfully compact and sort of buried, I guess is the right word, into the hill this house is. It hardly rises above the grade around it at all, and a very wonderful low sloped roof. And done in materials that I think are quite compatible with the Phoenix area. This is Corten steel, but it has a wonderful brown, the stone that's compatible. So there's a kind of total mix here of the house belonging to the land of the materials belonging to the environment, of facing the house south so that you get this wonderful sun, and then using the back wall of that house and a concrete slab on the living space as a potential way to help heat you in those cooler times. This is the little walkway that squeezes you down. And this is really a wonderful detail to me. You normally would think of stone as horizontal, but what he did is he turns it up. And it's almost as if there's a kind of eruption, a kind of in geological time that this house has kind of erupted out of the land. And it's a wonderful symbolic gesture, I think, for a house that belongs really in the landscape. Another kind of climate which affects, again, the capacity or the integrity of the house or the way it should be designed is hot and humid, and that's demonstrated by the South Atlantic, which many of you know perhaps. The first house is by Frank Harmon from North Carolina. He did it in what I would call a kind of contemporary version of the famous Charleston single house, a long, narrow house. Often you'll see a lot of these houses single wide so that you can ventilate through a large low-slope shed roof that allows air to come in here and then ventilate up to the top. And he did something else which I found quite interesting, and that is a kind of modern interpretation of the Charleston shutter system. These shutters are operable by the owner in a very easy fashion. They allow him to block the harsh sun at certain times of the year, and at the same time you can pull them down so that if you're leaving in the hurricane season or against the winds. It's a wonderful interpretation, I said, of Charleston architecture, and I think is quite appropriate for that area of the world. The next project is another in South Carolina. This one, however, is in the hills in western South Carolina. This is, again, this project done by our own office. This was a development that a man started in western South Carolina, thousands of acres of land. Started out as a lineman on the telephone pole, and started buying property, and before you know it, he was the biggest landholder in South Carolina, a big Republican fundraiser, and all the rest is history. He had a very wonderful idea to start with, and that is to make all these houses environmentally sensitive and work with the nature of the property. Unfortunately, that didn't really happen. Most of the houses, like any house you could find anywhere in the country. So when we got there, about 75% of that land had been, or houses had been built out. The owner, we had about 3 or 4 lots. We decided to just ask ourselves very simple questions. What in fact is South Carolina in the hills about? How many months of the year can you sit outside? The answer is, 10 probably, 9 or 10, maybe more. So our idea was to basically build an umbrella that would sit on a thin wall of glass and columns that would allow, with overhangs that would allow you actually just to take advantage of the South Carolina climate. How obvious can it be? But unfortunately, these are the kind of, again, timeless principles that we don't often think about. And placing the house on a plinth of stone that's from the immediate area, and then again allowing these kind of wonderful opportunities outside. This is the large umbrella roof that spans over the living space and the dining area. But the real issue here is this, and to be able to open this door completely, to put a screen that pulls down completely, to sit there most of the day and act as if you were actually outside. So obvious, it hurts, but why we don't rethink these ideas that are age-old is the question before us, I think, this evening. Probably my favorite house in the book is this one by Jim Cutler. In fact, the marketing material for this lecture showed a picture of it. And what I like so much about this house from the very beginning is the simple diagram for the site plan. A U-shaped house that protects you from, this is south, so that you can protect yourself from the constant winds of the Hawaii Islands. And also the U-shape allows you to take full advantage of all the views. It's such a simple diagram and yet so effective, and something we just in the first instance should be thinking about all the time. I like this house for kind of because it seems to be so magical. It's the kind of house you feel like you could kind of pull up to it, take it down, and cart it away in about 5 minutes. It's almost temporary on the landscape, which in some kind of ironic way, I think, in a paradoxical way perhaps, is really what houses I think should feel. But this relation to the slope, to the winds, the nature of the roof, the idea that this roof is kind of tied down with these tension rods that tie into the lava base of the house that you can see here. So it's all about an exercise in taking advantage of sun, of views, of fortifying your house against what is Hawaii really is all about, and that is the constant winds and yet the wonderful atmosphere and temperatures. You can sit outside most of the year. Jim Cutler was also the architect, along with Peter Bolin, who did Bill Gates's house out there in wherever they are. I think Jim Cutler, by the way, in my opinion, however unhumble it is probably one of the best American architects practicing residential, along with perhaps Peter Bolin. I think the both of them are really the best of architects who actually get it in the sense of examining the site closely, of interpreting the site, and then having a house that seems to really make sense. There's nothing phony about these houses at all. They're they have great integrity, I think. Now, a little subset to this kind of regionalism is neighborhoods, and I've chosen 2 neighborhoods from the Pacific, although this could be anywhere. And the reason I talk about neighborhoods is because sustainability is also about, in some ways, where you live. We don't always live in a wonderful open environment like Hawaii. Sometimes we have to build houses in cities and urban conditions. And this next house, it did just that. It's by Stephen Ehrlich from Los Angeles. A very dense site, as you can see here. The difficulty here is that how do you gain privacy and also at the same time openness that is so important in this environment when you really want to take advantage of this wonderful year-round weather that unfortunately in Massachusetts we don't have that often, but I think is very appealing in this house. And the way he did it is he introduced a low wall here. There's a pool that actually evaporates some of the water and occasionally helps to cool the house. And then there's a kind of exoskeleton of steel you can see here that has these wonderful shades that you can pull up and down and modulate, if you will, the amount of sunshine into the house. Now, could you do a house like this in Massachusetts? The answer is no. We'd freeze most of the year probably. But here it works, and it works quite well. He has a heating system in the floor for those very few times during the year when there is the need for heat, but for the most part, it's open year-round. This is the kind of problem that we face very often in architecture and that all of you may face as well. A client bought this piece of property. This is where the house was supposed to be sited. There was a brook running through the middle of it. Those clients decided to sell. They sold to another couple, and the town had said they could cover over the brook to get across to that house. And lo and behold, after they sold the property to the second couple, the town changed their mind, and they would not let them cross the brook at all. So what happened was, through a series of negotiations with the town, and this is really what happens more and more, I think, as the world gets more and more complicated and sites become rarer and rarer, and especially good sites, you're always involved in a kind of dynamic between town officials, neighbors, and all the people involved in how you design a house. So they came through a negotiation which they were allowed to push the house up to the corner, violating the zoning setbacks, in return for giving up some of this property, opening up this culvert so it became a nice spot to walk along, and then putting a little garage down there. And these are the drawings that result from those negotiations. You know, after months of negotiations, they were finally allowed to build this house. And it's a wonderful little traditional kind of Northern California house. And here's that wonderful Let's see if I... No. Sorry. I think that's it there, the little walkway that you go from the garage up to the house. All as a result, really, of being able to negotiate with the town about letting the brook be opened, take advantage of it, and giving up something in return for that issue. Sloping sites are some of the most difficult, particularly in this climate, the mount where it's very cold. You know, wonderful some months of the year, but very cold much of the rest. This by Peter Bolin. I think Peter did a wonderful job of siting the house in a kind of L fashion that allowed for sun to penetrate that, much like the main house we saw earlier. At the same time, situating the house on this sloping site in a way that the roof itself seems to belong to that slope. This is and a house that I think, from its materials and its sensitivity to the indigenous siting or planning around it, really is quite wonderful the way it fits in, and even so much as saving these wonderful aspens, which seem to have this kind of rhythm that works quite nicely with the house. This is the infinity pool. Interesting story. I think at one point in time, Peter told me that they went away, the owners went away, and the generator didn't work, and the infinity pool, shall I say, became infinity out into the infinity, and it broke through the glass on the other side, and they came home and there's a large icicle coming off the end of the house. Just a few more examples. This is what I call traditional transitional sites. And what I mean by that is not all one site is perfect in its sense of being one type. It could be hot and arid, but it could also be transitional, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm showing you a couple houses that I think take advantage of those transitional aspects of a site. This one in Carmel, in which it sits at the edge of a site that has a long meadow and then oaks here, live oaks. And what they did is the architects put the guest house up into the oaks and then let the main house, connected by a long walkway, expand out into the larger meadow. And you can see that here in that section that they've drawn. This particular way of building it's not exactly Ramderf, but it's like Ramderf, and it is partial concrete, partial sand. But it's wonderful in California in this way because, again, it does this simple principle of collecting the heat during the day and giving it off at night. And also these wonderful details of using a kind of arts and crafts Adirondack style mix here for this house. I think fits quite lovely in this transitional. You can see here the transition between the oaks here and the larger house down there. You know, and most of these houses, by the way, are not big houses. I mean, there's this notion that all architects do are big houses. This house probably is no more than 2,200 square feet. So it's not about size at all, although I have no objection to large houses. I think if you want to build a large house, you should be able to build a large house. The problem is that most large houses built today are ugly, and they're not well designed. And there are plenty of examples, I think, of large houses in our culture, in Massachusetts in particular. You don't have to go very far to Concord, to Newton, to Lexington, all these places where Cambridge, where there's some really lovely large houses, well designed and very, very well liked. And I don't think that's a problem. The problem is we've sort of given up quality for size, and it's become a real substitute. And it's really unsustainable when you think about it, because these large houses have to be taken care of. I'm reminded of a lecture that you know, Choprino Wharton, who probably do some of the best large houses in the country. And Alan came to a lecture at Harvard one summer for me and talked about this big houses he was doing. And he said that he had a client who the wife wanted 95 degrees water. I'm not sure I got the numbers quite right. She wanted 95 degrees for her swimming pool, and the husband wanted 89 degrees. And so instead of waiting an hour or two, they did two pools side by side, different degrees. Those kind of wasteful gestures of the late 20th and early 21st century, I think, are gone, I hope, but we'll see. Finally, a house in the Midwest. Not my favorite house from a stylistic point of view, but I think interesting because the architect had this idea of going through a cornfield, placing a house, a kind of sodbuster house, at the edge of that cornfield, just at the bottom of a little rise. And here's a sketch. So often you find that this very first sketch that someone does is very much the way the house finally turns out in a certain kind of way. And here's that little sodbuster roof. And again, one room wide, a kind of theme we've seen a lot of for ventilation in these houses throughout. Almost farm-like industrial building, wonderful windows facing south here, and then these transoms up high on the north side to allow this to ventilate. And we're just two more projects. One of the things I think we forget about is that urban sites actually have sites that can be used or reused perhaps in different ways. We think of siting a house as finding a piece of property, tearing down a house, building a new house, or finding a virgin piece of land and building a house on it. When in fact you can renovate something or find a piece of property in a city and make a new site in a kind of funny way. This house in Montana by Richard Ferno, he had an idea originally of going to Montana and buying, like everyone else buys, 20 acres and having a small ranchette. And everybody has a 20-acre ranchette in Montana. And at the last minute he said to himself, he told me that I just realized it was the most unsustainable thing I could possibly do, is to do what everyone else doing. Everyone has a ranchette, everyone has a driveway, everyone da-da-da. So what he did is he went into the small little village that was left over from the cow town period of this town and bought this little building here, and he turned it into a winter and summer house for his family. And it was an old bank. You can see the vault here. Added a couple lofts. This is kind of Depression area photo, but actually is his wife and kids in the old house. And really, it became a very sustainable way to do things, I thought. You know, why not the most sustainable thing we can do is actually reuse the houses we already own in the first instance. There's all kinds of studies, and I don't know all the statistics exactly, but it's obviously if the house is a horrible house to begin with and not worth saving, then tear it down. But you can you waste energy by tearing a house down, having to throw away all these things that were part of the original house and start all over again on many occasions. So all they did was to renovate this front, which is really quite lovely, and they actually put asphalt siding on this kind of roofing shingles on the front of it, which I think is a kind of fun idea. And finally, this house in Washington, D.C., this is in a very sensitive neighborhood. This is Georgetown. You can't really build anything that faces the street that people can see. But what the developer and architect decided to do was to build a new structure on top of that roof and build 4 new condominiums in the back and 2 in the existing facility. So in effect what they did was to make a new site. And you can imagine how many of these sites, and you can see here the Georgetown neighborhood and the fact you can't actually see those buildings, but in the back in the alley you can. You can imagine how many potential sites there are in this country in existing cities like this. This effort to continually move out towards the suburbs at some point in time has to stop. Energy reasons alone will make it stop. Frank Lloyd Wright once said that the battle between the suburbs and the city will be won by the race between the car and the elevator. He was wrong in a lot of ways. I think Broadacre City, however interesting it was as a concept, is actually not sustainable these days, and we have to rethink how we do our architecture up and close into the city. And Boston is really a fantastic example of a city that is beginning to build more and more housing, find more and more unused sites, and it is in a way, in a very first instance, a very sustainable way of doing things. And they're quite interesting, these condominiums here. the one last project, and this again is by Peter Boland. Peter Boland's the only one in the book that I gave 2 projects to other than our own firm, because I do again think he's one of the best architects practicing in the country. Just a magical man, and gets it, I think, in terms of how to site houses. This was a site, and I close with this because he took such amazing pains to show every single tree on this wooded site. And you can imagine the help in the office telling him, do I really have to do this? Or the surveyor saying, do you really want me to put where all those trees are? And he did. And it's a wooded site. Wooded sites are tough. They don't get a lot of sun. But he found this magical little ridge that ran right through the site there. And the transition between parking and through the house became the sort of modus of this house. And it's really quite a lovely little cabin for a couple that like to rock climb. And that's really what this house is about, is coming to upstate New York and finding a little piece in the woods. And this wonderful ability to break down the scale of this house into small pieces, almost a cabin-like, and then to put these kind of layers of color and material. I mean, this house is probably no more than 1,200 square feet, although it feels quite a bit larger. So I just sort of closing say that I want to say again that the only reason for talking about this is that I think we have lost our integrity in houses. We've lost a sense of houses belonging to the sites, and we've lost what we had. And it seems to me that with some re-education that we can get it back. I don't know whether I'm optimistic about that another 40 million houses that are going to be, or 75 million that are coming. That is a system of house building that's connected with bankers, brokers, and builders that we may not be able to break. But I do think that homeowners and well-educated clients, and in addition meaningful and collaborative architects working together can change that in some hopefully meaningful way by re-examining really truths that have been there all along. So I'll end it there and be delighted to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, will you please raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone and you can pass it around.
Don't be shy. Artie?
That was great.
Questions at all? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Jeremiah. Very interesting, thank you. In our research in the magazine, we see that landscaping is the #1 plan ahead in the next 6 to 12 months for a lot of our readers. Do you work with the landscaping? How does that work in the interface as an architect in siting in the beginning and so on?
Steve, thanks for bringing that up. That's a very good question. I think that the best houses are a unique combination of the landscape architect, should have said that in the lecture, the architect and perhaps interior designer. The best houses I have done are that team put together in a way that really answers all the questions. The landscape architecture has really come alive, I think, in the last 10 or 20 years in this country, and I think they're doing some of the most exciting things. For instance, this kind of collaboration of the High Line down there in New York between a landscape architect and an architect, I think is fantastic. I mean, it's a wonderful, sustainable way to reuse part of the city. So the answer to your question is, yeah, you always, if you can, want to work with a landscape architect. Yes, Bob.
Jeremiah, could you share with the group some of the interesting environmental issues you dealt with in the house that you're starting in Green Harbor?
Bob's talking about a project on Marshfield that is over what's known in the world of DEP as the mean high water mark, which means that, I don't know if you know this, but when Governor, who was it, who's the Republican governor who went to New York? Well, signed the Rivers Act in whenever that was, and jumped into the Cambridge River, I believe, at the same time, actually gave up the private property rights of many people at the time, none of us. But part of that push was what's called presumptive jurisdiction, which means that the DEP, your favorite Massachusetts state environmental body, actually has control over the mean high water mark unless you can demonstrate forcefully that in fact all your rights were there previous to that period, I think 1987. So we've been involved in taking down an old house and putting a new house on piles up over the water, and we spent 18 months in the permitting process with DEP. The local permitting process, as you might imagine, conservation, zoning, historical, were all perfectly fine. They wanted to do the house. The old house was an eyesore, and they really were looking forward. But the DEP actually made the owner go through an extensive process of proving that this whole piece of property, including the neighborhood, was in fact had the right to build, and it wasn't something that they had presumptive jurisdiction over. And I guess the reason to bring it up is not that regulations by themselves are bad, but 18 months seems to me to be a bit excessive, and you never found, you never had a sense at any point in time that anybody at DEP was actually paying much attention or cared about the fact that there was essentially a depression in the construction industry in Marshfield, and that people were actually wanted to build this house. I finally wrote the governor, and I saw in the Globe that the governor was in Israel, and then he went to London and went all over the place looking for jobs to bring back to Massachusetts. And I wrote him a letter. I said, you know, I'm delighted that you're over there looking for this work, but I just want to tell you about a little job down in Marshfield that in fact is a stimulus program for that economy. Won't cost you anything. There's a tax base involved, and there's actually mitigation when the owner has to give a certain fee back to the town for a building. You know, in the private industry, in the public industry, it's called mitigation. In the private world, it's called extortion. But what actually, and nobody answered, you know. And then 2 or 3 months later, I wrote another letter to the governor. I was reminding him that I wrote in the first letter, and I said, you know, I really think this is something you ought to. And they called, and they said, gee, thanks for the second letter. We lost your first letter. So I said, okay. So, but they all due respect to them, they finally, 2 days later, we got the permit for that house. But it's funny because I think if we're going to have a culture in which regulation is important and environment is important, I mean, I understand the respect of the waterways and all that, but we have to work together in a meaningful fashion and give incentives to the public sector to act in a forceful and a meaningful way that protects, not only protects us, but allows people to live their lives the way they want to live their lives. So that's sort of the history behind that. Any other questions?
I'd like to know where we can buy your book.
Well, I get $2.50 every time someone does. I want to say that first. And so you can go on to Amazon, and I think, you know, get it. It's still on Amazon at a reduced rate, no doubt. But there is, yeah. They used to sell it at Borders, yeah, yeah. Now, I'm really humbled that all you know, friends and colleagues are here this evening to listen to what is really a passion of mine, as I hope you can tell, and I hope that you carry with it your own passion about getting it right. It's really just thinking. It's not complicated, and using principles that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So I thank you again for all coming. Thank you.